On behalf of the SLCC Concurrent Enrollment Program, I'd like to welcome you to this training for high school counselors on how to use some of the tools and resources that we've created to help you guide students who are taking concurrent enrollment classes to choose the best classes given their college and career goals. So today in this training, we'll be going over the following. First of all, we'll talk about why concurrent enrollment students even need advising and guidance in the first place. We'll talk about the purpose of the advising program, how it works. We'll talk about some of the problems that this advising program was designed to address and the solutions and how we work collaboratively with counselors over the last couple of years to develop the solution and the new program. And we'll also give you a little bit of the history of the advising program. We'll also talk about the 3 phases to the advising program and how you as counselors are involved in that in partnership with SLCC advisors. Next, we'll talk about the vital role that counselors play in making this advising program even possible for concurrent enrollment students. And we'll talk about some of the best ways that you can help students. As we go through each of these advising phases, we'll also talk about the resources and the tools that will empower you to offer advising to your students with minimal effort and time. We'll be doing a deep dive of the tools as we go through each of those phases. And finally, we'll talk about the partnership between you as a counselor and the SLCC advisor and how together the two of you can work to advise the student and give them all the guidance they need to ensure they're on the right path for their college and career goals. So let me now give you a brief overview of the concurrent enrollment advising origin story and how this program came about between Salt Lake Community College and our high school counseling partners. So up until about 2020, the concurrent enrollment advising program consisted of 5 concurrent enrollment advisors who would sit down one-on-one with concurrent enrollment students and help them to map out the requirements for an associate degree so that they could work towards the New Century Scholarship. These 5 advisors also worked as admissions recruiters, and the reality is only about a quarter of their time was allocated to provide concurrent enrollment advising. When we looked at the data, we realized that these 5 advisors were only serving about 150 students to maybe 200 students every year. But we also discovered when we ran the data that there were over 1,700 students that were accumulating 12 or more credits and were not receiving any form of advising. And in just a minute, we'll talk about why that's important. So when we went back to the drawing board and we looked at those 1,700 students, we looked at the current workload and capacity of the advisors who were providing those 1-hour advising sessions, we realized that there was no possible way that we could reach those 1,700 students who needed some form of guidance in the concurrent courses that they were taking. And so in 2020, we reached out to the district counselors at each of the 5 major districts that we work with. And we asked them to identify a couple of counselors within their district at certain high schools. And then we pulled that group together to talk about how we would reach these 1,700 students. If there was something that we could do collaboratively to reach these students without creating additional workload or overburdening any one person. And so over the next 2 years, this group of advisors and district advisors came together with Salt Lake Community College, and we talked about and developed the current advising model. So now let's talk about why do concurrent enrollment students even need advising in the first place? The thing with concurrent enrollment is that it saves students and their parents an enormous amount of time and money, and then also it helps them to figure out how to navigate some of the challenges of higher education in a safe environment in the high school so that later when they transition to college, they know how to meet deadlines, they know how to advocate for themselves, they know how to pace themselves. They learn all these soft skills that help them to navigate some of the challenges they face in college. Now, of course, parents and students don't focus as much on the latter, which I think is the more important part of concurrent enrollment. They focus on the money saved. And sometimes that mentality forces parents and students to say, well, if concurrent enrollment saves me money, then the more concurrent classes I take, the more money I save, right? Well, not necessarily. And let me give you sort of an allegory, a metaphor to why that may not be the case. Imagine if a store had a deal. It was a crazy awesome deal. So let's say they're selling hamburger buns for 10 cents a bag. And you see that deal and you're like, dang, I got to get me some hamburger buns because this summer I've got a big family barbecue and surely we're going to need like lots of hamburger buns. So I'm going to go and I load up my truck with hamburger buns and I take them home and I stick them into my freezer, knowing that, this has saved me a ton of money down the road. Well, then summer comes around and your family decides, you know what, I think we're actually going to do like a hot dog. I know we've done hamburgers for a few years, but we're going to do hot dogs this year. And we could probably still do a few hamburgers, but we're mostly going to do hot dogs. Most of the family want hot dogs. So the family event rolls around, you go to the park, you use maybe 3 or 4 bags of hamburger buns, and then you come back and you've got all these buns still in the freezer. So over the next year or two, you've got an event here and there, you pull a few out, but in the end, you end up with a whole bunch of buns that were never used, they get freezer burned, and now you got to throw them out. Because this allure of saving money overrode the rational desire to say, well, shouldn't this event be planned first? And shouldn't you be 100% certain there's going to be this many people and you're going to need this many buns? And so in the end, a lot of money was wasted. So how does that relate to concurrent enrollment? So let's say that a student decides that they want to save all this time and money, so they take every concurrent enrollment class as possible at their high school. So they take a welding class, they take a history class, a humanities class, they take maybe a math class, and then maybe a couple more art classes. And then they decide, well, I'm going to be an engineer. So I'm going to go up to the university and I'm going to study engineering. They get accepted in the program, and the program says, hey, welcome to engineering program. The student says, I got all this concurrent enrollment. And the engineering program looks at it and says, well, but none of these classes are engineering classes. We don't require any of these classes for our engineering program, so this doesn't really help you, except for it does impact your federal financial aid eligibility, because federal financial aid will cover 150% of the credits needed to get a degree. Well, you've already completed about 50% of those credits, and so if you start your engineering degree right now and you keep going through for the full 4 years, you're going to be in a good place. So just don't change your mind. And so the student starts the program, and a year into the engineering program, they realize, wait a second, engineering requires math? What's up with that? Math is hard. I don't want to do this. So they switch over to humanities. And then, a year or so into humanities, they say, well, I don't know if I'm going to make any money doing this. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, but I think I'd rather do business. Now they switch over. Well, now they're starting a business degree, and they only have 50% of their financial aid left available to them. And so now they're going to run into problems if they're relying on that money. And that's why it's very important that students from the get-go start taking college classes with a plan in mind. Now, as a counselor, you're probably thinking, well, but I don't really feel confident guiding a student in which college classes they need for a specific degree. And that's a legitimate concern, and that's something that we actually addressed as we were working on building this advising program. So the level of advising that a counselor will be providing is going to be very different than the level of advising a college academic advisor would work with a student on. So you're going to find that the advising that you'll be doing as a counselor is going to be very simple, very basic, but very powerful in helping students select the right concurrent enrollment classes as they begin this college journey. All right, so now that you understand the history and the origin story of the advising model, why advising is important for a student in helping them to select the best classes for their college or career goals, now we're going to do a quick overview of the 3 phases, and then in the next video, we'll walk through each of those phases in much more detail. So the first phase is the prepare phase. This is phase 1. During the prepare phase, a student receives preparatory information so that they can be successful in their very first concurrent enrollment class. Phase 1 happens before a student even takes their first concurrent enrollment class. And as you'll see later, this phase is a joint partnership between the counselor, the concurrent enrollment coordinator at the high school, and the CE advisor. Phase 2 is the build phase. During this phase, a student works with their high school counselor to build an academic plan. Now that may sound scary, but the reality is most of the tools and resources we've created to help you as a counselor are very easy to use, and a lot of it is just video tutorials and other resources that you simply hand over to the student, send them on their way, and then follow up. So you'll find that when we talk about working with a student to build an academic plan, that the load is very, very light for a counselor. Phase 3 is the transition phase, and this is the phase where you provide them information about how to transition to college and how to wrap up their degree or certificate if they're working on completing that at the time of high school graduation or right before or shortly thereafter. So this phase, again, is just you providing some basic information and resources. So now let's go ahead and dive over into the next video, and we'll go into detail on how phase 1 works and your role as a high school counselor.